today we're going to be talking about a variety of tactics that you can use to increase both learning and performance. So the objectives I have for you guys for today, to basically differentiate between what's performance and what's learning. So what's a performance task versus an acquisition task. Identifying learner levels. So I'm going to present a variety of tactics here today, and some are appropriate for some learners, while some other tactics could be more appropriate for more advanced learners. So just knowing which kind of learner or which kind of child you're working with here. Learning, of course, the tactics to increase performance and learning, and then appropriately and correctly applying these tactics in order to increase motivation. So for those of you that are therapists in the crowd here, raise your hand, I guess, if you have a BCBA supervisor. Okay, so if you see any tactics as we're going through them here, as I'm describing one, if you hear that one sounds particularly good for a child that you're working with, make sure to ask them about it. They're also all evidence-based, published tactics. So if you go on Google Scholar, you'll be able to find articles about it as well, because I'm going to briefly touch on a variety of tactics. I'm not going to really explain how to do them, from start to finish today. We don't have time for that, unfortunately. So, learning versus performance. Charles Catania describes learning as roughly the acquisition or the process by which behavior is added to an organism's repertoire, a relatively permanent change in behavior. So you're teaching the organism or the child something new. It's typically defined as the acquisition of knowledge or skills as a function of contact with something in the environment. So you may have heard the saying, you haven't taught unless the child's learned something. Whereas performance, that's behavior that has been treated as an index of something else. But it's basically behavior that's already been learned, it's mastered, and the child is emitting the behavior, which just means displaying the behavior. The child is emitting the behavior. It's fluent, it's not something that they're learning, it's something they already know how to do. The primary function of instruction, so our job as therapists and parents, is to facilitate permanent learning, long-term changes in understanding, comprehension, and skills. So we want to do something to sort of change this child's environment. Performance tasks are important as well, but they're different than learning tasks. So here's some examples of learning that I came up with. So phonemes, so learning, you know all your letter names, now you know the phonemes. You know that B is the sound that letter B makes. Rhyming versus not rhyming words, counting to 10 in a different language, learning the names of your classmates, learning animal names and their sounds, how to do long division, writing cursive letters. I know I'm dating myself there. I don't think we're teaching cursive letters anymore. And then holding a pencil correctly. So these are things that a child may not know how to do and how we're going to teach them to do. And then they're learning that new skill. Whereas performance, on the other hand, these are things like raising your hand to gain the teacher's attention as opposed to screaming or getting up out of your seat or saying, ooh, 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 ooh. Saying excuse me before interrupting the conversation of others, walking versus running, especially in the hallways, sitting down in a chair or using an inside voice. A child may know how to use an inside voice, but they elect to yell in the classroom or in the living room. So this is something they already know how to do. It's just about arranging their environment to create motivational conditions so that they want to do that. So learning versus performance, as learners acquire new skills, they can build upon the skills they already have and acquire new repertoires. Most skills begin as learning and become performance skills as the learner becomes more fluent. So learning to take the subway, learning to drive, those are things you initially had to learn to do, and you all made it here, so I would imagine it's all performance for you now. Although the New York City subway sometimes, of course, is a learning task for all of us. So that's learning versus performance. So performance eventually becomes learning. Here we go. This is what I was just describing. So writing the alphabet, driving, reciting phone numbers, and there's something called MANDs. Some of our therapists here might know what a MAND is. MANDs is derived from the word command or demand. It just means request. Children initially learn to MAND. They learn to use their language to mediate their environment and gain things from you, the listener. And then once that becomes fluent, then it becomes performance behavior, not a learned behavior. Consequating target behavior. So BX is a code for behavior. So as a skill set becomes more fluent, you should theoretically be able to thin the schedule of reinforcement for that behavior. So what that means is when you're initially learning something, you're going to need a lot of feedback. a lot of positive attention and praise for emitting that behavior or for displaying that behavior. But as you become more fluent and you become better at it, you're going to need less and less reinforcement. So for example, I'm taking swimming lessons right now at the Y. Initially, when I'm getting my stroke down and my instructor's looking at me and telling me, good job, and I'm looking at him to make sure that I'm, moving my arms in the right freestyle motion. Now that I've had 6 lessons and I'm doing better, I don't look at him as often because the behavior is becoming more of a performance behavior and I'm getting better, slowly but surely. For behaviors that are not naturally reinforced by their consequences, you will need to continue to provide reinforcement in the form of social reinforcement, so praise, smiles, high fives, pats on the backs, things like that. Or prosthetic reinforcement. Prosthetic just means things that are not the natural reinforcement for the behavior. So edibles, toys, access to an activity. I believe probably everyone in this room has said, if you do X, you will get Y. Or first we do X, then we get to Y. Generally speaking, you're using either a prosthetic reinforcer in that case. So, if we're able to get through the grocery store, then we can stop at the park. Stopping at the park is not a natural consequence for going to the grocery store, but it's something you might create in your environment to have a successful grocery trip. Okay, for skills that are being learned, you will need to reinforce every discrete trial. The size of the trial is going to, of course, depend on the level of the learner. So like I said, especially if you're introducing something new and challenging, you're going to want to give feedback every trial. But the size of the trial is going to vary. And I'll get into that in a few slides. So in 1957, B.F. Skinner, the father of radical behaviorism, wrote Verbal Behavior. And from that theory, verbal behavior development theory was born. This is it gets pretty dense, but I just tried to pull out just the pieces about the different kind of learners that we may face. So basically, because it's a behavioral sort of way of identifying children, it goes by what's observable, so listening and speaking. We have a few seats up here if anyone's interested. So we have what's called pre-listener, pre-speaker, because that means your job, they're not speaking or listening yet, but that's your job to get them listening and speaking. So they're not speaking or listening yet. We've got listener, pre-speaker, so kids that are listening, but they're not yet speaking. Generally, your receptive or your listener comes in first, and then your speaker develops after. Listener, speaker, and then we have speaker as own listener and reader, writer, but we'll get to those in a second. Who here, show of hand, works with pre-listener, pre-speaker, or listener, pre-speakers? So kids that aren't yet vocal. Okay, great. And then who here works with kids that are listening and speaking already? Okay, great. So we're going to go over tactics for both as well as reader writers. So basically, you're going to see this chart a few times in this slide here, in this PowerPoint here, rather. A pre-listener, pre-speaker, I'm just going to describe them a little bit for you. They're dependent upon others for survival. They're not yet responding to directions, commands, and requests. A pre-listener is different than a non-listener. A pre-listener is someone who doesn't yet, can't yet differentiate what you're saying and complete the task, whereas a non-listener hears you, understands you, and elects not to do it. I have tactics for both of those types of kids, but you want to make sure to differentiate between a pre-listener and a non-listener. Potential skills that you're targeting for increase with a pre-listener, pre-speaker, that would be following directions with visual cues, responding to name, look at me, look here, sit still. Things like that. So those are things that maybe some of you that are working with that population are working on. Whereas listener pre-speakers, these guys, they can perform verbally governed behavior. So for example, one step followed vocal directions. And they can comply with directions as well. The learner is still dependent on you, but direct dependent physical contact can be replaced by the fact that you can ask them to go get their shoes because you're going to the store and they're able to go ahead and do that. You're going to start working on some point to and match programs, so some selection programs. You can work on sorting by category, following vocal directions, and gestural man. So they'll be requesting either by pointing or by getting the item and bringing it to you, things like that. Listener and speakers, now they're able to mediate their environment through you, the listener. As a speaker, they're able to say, hey, can you pass the salt? Or I'm hungry, or I don't want to go there today. They're able to affect your behavior through their vocal behavior as a speaker. Now we can work on vocal mands and vocal tacks. Again, mands requests, they come from command demands. Tacks come from contact with the environment. A tact is labeling something you see. So, hey, look, an airplane, or, oh, did you get your hair cut? It's labeling something in the environment for the purpose of a social interaction. So we treat those differently. So if a child requests something or they demand for something, what we're going to do is deliver that item. Whereas if they tack something, you're going to acknowledge. So that's generally what parents do, naturally. This is called a penguin. And then later on, the child sees a penguin and labels it. Look, mommy, a penguin. That's right, it is a penguin, honey. So you're doing that for two different things. So you're asking for milk, or you're labeling a penguin. So speaker as own listener. Now you're starting to have some exchange in your own mind, what's called covert behavior, behavior beneath the skin. You're listening to your own verbal behavior. Learners listen to their own verbal behavior. So first I do this, then I do that. Now they've achieved a significant level of independence. Now they can start to work on cooperative play, sequencing, telling time, counting money, labeling actions and emotions, things like that. So higher level skills. They're able to just have a little bit more self-management and sort of mediate their own learning at this point. And then they're working on the skills to become a reader-writer. So now you're able to actually read directions and follow them. You're able to write something and affect your environment through writing. And you don't have to worry about time and space. So once you have reader-writer levels of verbal behavior, you don't have to worry about someone else being there present in that moment. You can send an email, or you can write a note. Now they're working on some more advanced skills like writing a book report, or answering comprehension questions. So now we're going to talk about what's called schedules of reinforcement. So that means how often are you delivering feedback to the child? So your schedules of reinforcement, again, how often you're delivering, whether it's tokens, whether it's praise, edibles, whatever you're using as reinforcement. So in your ABC, your antecedent behavior consequence, the C of your consequence, that schedule is going to vary on the levels of verbal behavior of your learner, if they're a pre-listener, pre-speaker versus a reader-writer, whether the skill or the task is performance or learning. And as the learner progresses through the levels of verbal behavior, the schedule of reinforcement should be thinned. So you wouldn't be giving, an edible to a reader-writer for every correct response, but you also wouldn't be expecting a pre-listener, pre-speaker, someone who is 4 years old and non-vocal, to get to go to the park at the end of the week. That's not an appropriate schedule of reinforcement. So as the learner progresses through the different levels of verbal behavior, you want to thin out the schedule of reinforcement and move from prosthetic to natural. And you also, as the task becomes more fluent, as it becomes a performance task from a learning task, you want to thin out that schedule of reinforcement as well. Have any of you heard the term schedules of reinforcement before tonight? Raise your hand if you have. Okay, so a few of you, about a third of you have, great. So there's 4 different components to schedules of reinforcement. There's fixed and variable. That's going to be your first word to describe it. And interval and ratio is going to be your second word to describe it. Fixed means it's a set number, so every third response. Variable is about every third response. So about every third response would be every one response, 2 response, 3, 4 responses. Interval is amount of time, and then ratio is amount of responses. So if you had, for example, a fixed interval, that would be, every 2 minutes you deliver reinforcement. If you had a variable interval, it would be about every 2 minutes you deliver reinforcement. Whereas if you had a fixed ratio, that would be every 3 correct responses, they get an edible. Whereas a variable ratio would be about every 3 responses, they get an edible. Basically, I definitely recommend variable schedules over fixed schedules pretty much 100% of the time. The only time I use a fixed schedule is if I'm on what's called an FR1, which is for every correct response, you're delivering a reinforcement in some way. Otherwise, variable is better. I don't know how many of you have been to Atlantic City or Vegas, but the reason everyone sits at those slot machines for so long is because it's variable. If you got, if you won big, if you hit whatever, 3 cherries or whatever, every 5 times you pull the lever, then you would pull that lever 5 times, and then you'd wait for your money, and then you go to the next machine and see who just got up at the 4th pull, so you could sit down and pull that lever. But if it's variable, you don't know when it's coming, so you're going to sit there all night. So definitely, just in terms of increasing target behaviors or increasing the good behaviors, you want to put that on a variable schedule. Whether it's interval or ratio, that's going to depend on the behavior you're measuring. So generally speaking, if you're working on a new skill and you have a child that's earning edibles, and you don't want to give an edible for every correct response, then you want to put them on, let's say, a variable ratio of 3. So about every 3 correct responses, they get an edible. The other 2 times, they get praise. The reason I suggest variable over fixed is because you can see, so in variable ratio and fixed ratio, you're getting a higher, this is called just a steeper slope, which means it's faster learning in these 2. And then as well, variable, again, is a steeper slope. That means faster learning. This is called the scalloped trend. And what that is the behavior increases around, let's say it was on a FR5. Every 5th response, you're going to see an increase because they know that's when the reinforcement's coming. So, and that comes from like the pigeon and dog studies. Basically, all you need to know is just be aware of how often you're delivering reinforcement and what your plan is to fade it out is kind of the point of all of this. But we're going to talk about how to do it with the different learners now. Pre-listener, pre-speaker. I left the middle column the same here, just to keep that in mind from what we talked about earlier. For learning, you want them on an FR1. So whether it's praise, prosthetic reinforcement, tickles, bubbles, depending on their age, of course, tickles may not be appropriate, but for learning, you want them on an FR1. You want them earning tokens, stickers, bubbles, whatever. Performance, you can have them on like a VR2 or a variable interval 1 minute. So if they're doing something that's already mastered, they shouldn't be receiving the same level of reinforcement as something that's a learning skill. You want them to kind of differentiate because you don't want them to kind of satiate on your reinforcement either. Whereas a listener pre-speaker, you still should have them on an FR1, meaning you're consequating every time you ask them to come here or, sort their colors, things like that. You should be giving them feedback. But now you can kind of rotate between tokens and stickers, access to their favorite toy, and praise. So they should be on a thinner schedule of prosthetic reinforcement. And for performance, depending on your learner, every 3 minutes or so, they should be getting some feedback from you. Listener speakers, these guys should really be on tokens, not prosthetic reinforcement. So they should be earning tokens and then trading in those tokens for a backup reinforcer. And these guys should be able to sit and do a performance activity for 5 minutes at a time. And then our speaker is on listener. These guys working on tokens or points, things like that, and natural reinforcement. So natural reinforcement for the behavior. So working on a puzzle, not because for every puzzle piece they're getting a goldfish, but because they want to complete the puzzle and admire their hard work. Performance skill, about every 10 minutes or so, they should be getting some feedback from you. And by feedback, I mean approvals for doing the right thing. So you have your rules set up for them, and you need to catch them being good, not just give them feedback when they're doing something wrong. Certainly catch them being good and delivering specific praise associated with that. And we'll talk more about that in a bit. Reader writers, really natural reinforcement, and the size of the task is going to vary for these guys. So they may be working on a book report and they're not going to get feedback until they do their entire book report, and that might be a half-hour long task. Types of reinforcers, we talked about this a little bit, but prosthetic reinforcement, this is doing an activity, for example, bouncing on a trampoline, getting to color, doing paint, things like that, access to an item, or edibles. Generalized, that's tokens, things you trade in for backup reinforcers. Money, tokens. Social, smile, tickles, social praise, thumbs up. And natural. Natural consequence of behavior. So a song comes on the radio, you don't like this song, you change the radio station. The natural consequence for that behavior is that you don't have to listen to that terrible song anymore. Writing a note to a friend, you get to contact what's going on with your friends. That's the natural reinforcement for the behavior. There's no prosthetic reinforcement built in there. Okay, so these are the types of reinforcers you should be using for your clients. Pre-listener, pre-speakers, you're going to want to use vocal praise as well. I love how you're having nice hands. I love how you're sitting still. But your vocal praise, you can't assume that that's functioning to reinforce their behavior. And what I mean by that is you can't assume that just because you're praising them, that's going to elicit that same behavior in the future. Your praise is great, but they may not even understand what you're saying at this point. So you really want to pair that with something that means something to them. So whether that's tickles, smiles, goldfish crackers, pre-listener, speaker. Now you can start to use some tokens, social reinforcement, and you can continue to use prosthetic. Listener, speaker, same thing as pre-listener, speaker. And then reader, writer. These guys really should be on generalized reinforcement. So whether they're doing tally marks, counting their tally marks and trading in at the end, social reinforcement and natural reinforcement for the behavior. So when you're sort of thinking about how to motivate your learner, here you want to think about what levels of verbal behavior they're on. Are you using an appropriate reinforcement for their level? What schedule of reinforcement are they on? Were you praising them for every puzzle piece they were putting in, and now you expect them to do the whole puzzle by themselves with no feedback, and it's a 24-piece puzzle because you just went from an FR1 to an FR24 to an FR1, so you just kind of yanked the rug out from under them. You want to fade out your schedule of reinforcement in almost a seamless way that they don't even feel it happening. Kind of the way that you guys, go to work and you have this many job requirements, and now you have this more added responsibility and this added responsibility and this added responsibility. It just kind of, but you keep rising to that expectation. And of course, your reinforcer type. So again, moving from prosthetic towards generalized towards natural. So these are a list of tactics. These are evidence-based tactics from the ABA literature. Also, I have my email on the last slide. You guys feel free to email me. I'd be happy to email you the PowerPoint as well. Might make it easier for Googling some of these things. But basically, what we're going to talk about is some of these tactics here. And I just want to see how I'm doing on time here. Okay, great. We're going to talk about some of these tactics and how to use them, what some examples are, and then we'll talk about what you guys have done that has been effective so far. So something like a stimulus prompt, how many of you are running discrete trials with your learners here? Okay. So a stimulus prompt, that would be really for a discrete trial. That's when you make something in the stimulus more salient. So if you wanted them, for example, if you had 3 flashcards out and you wanted them to point to the horse, you would put the horse a little bit closer to them. Modeling, that's pretty self-explanatory. Tokens, we're going to talk about tokens a little bit more. Planned ignoring, that's when you know that they're emitting a bad behavior for your attention, as long as the child is safe. When a certain behavior is emitted for your attention, you're going to ignore it until they're emitting a good target behavior, in which case you'll give them your attention. Increasing opportunities to respond, that's something where, if you're teaching, let's say, red, yellow, green, and blue, and they're really struggling with red, you would just give them more opportunities to respond to red. Some of these are self-explanatory. Some of these are a little bit tricky. Chaining, there's backwards chaining, forward chaining, and that's what you would use when you're doing a task analysis. So brushing your teeth, hand washing, use it a lot for ADL skills, but even something like making a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Vicarious reinforcement, that's one of my favorites. That's when you praise other children for doing the right thing. So if you have one child that's standing up and you have 4 kids that are sitting, you're going to praise everybody for sitting. And instead of telling the child who's standing to sit down, it's likely that if your praise functions as a reinforcer, that child will sit down as well. These are some examples of token boards. Again, if you have a higher level learner, you can certainly use a notepad with tally marks where they can count. They can learn to count by 5s and trade in their tokens that way. So your top right, the reward menu, you want to have your tokens. That's for more advanced learners, I guess. So you might have you might start out with a simple token board like this, where they put what they're working for in that top box, and then when they earn all of their maters, so those 5 maters, then they get access to that item. For higher level learners, you might have something like a reward menu, where if they get 10 tokens, they get to look at a book, but if they get 20 tokens, they get a 10-minute break, things like that, access to the iPad. Tokens should be delivered contingent on correct responses to the rules that you set up, and as well as correct responding to programming. So your rules, and we'll talk more about rules later, but basically you want to set them up positively, and you want to just keep catching those kids being good. This is an example of a good behavior checklist. So what you would do is you base the rules or the things that you're working on the checklist on that child individually. You set the timer. Again, variable is more preferred. So let's say you're doing about every 10 minutes. So that would be between every 7 and 12 minutes or so, the timer goes off. If they were able to sit nicely in their chair, have quiet hands and feet, and use nice words and do their work for that duration of time, you're going to check under yes for each box. And then they get access to something for following those rules. This is just a positive way to sort of target those things, as opposed to waiting for that child to fall out of their chair and put their feet on the table, and then you're like, no, we sit nicely in our chair. This is a way to kind of catch them being good while it's happening. If the interval is going and they break one of the rules, that gives you the opportunity to have them check on the no side. Also, what you'd want to do then is access their reinforcer. So if they're working for gummies, you can go ahead and say, okay, you weren't having nice hands, like the gummy goes back over here. But you can earn it again. Let's pull ourselves together and work for it. But this is just a way to sort of let them know what the expectations are, so that way they can be successful in that. So token boards and good behavior checklists are definitely two big ones that I like to use. So this is some examples of how you would apply these tactics. Again, we don't have time today to go. I could do a whole course on how to do all of them. Certainly, if you have questions about specific tactics, feel free to email me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. But these are some examples that I picked out for today. A stimulus prompt, so you're going to want to enhance the stimulus. The stimulus is the A in antecedent behavior consequence. To make a correct response more likely, you'd want to use that with a pre-listener, pre-speaker. Token economy, you can use bingo daubers, you can use stamps, points. It teaches one-to-one correspondence. It keeps them on task for longer, as opposed to giving them a break every few trials. You are giving them just a quick, here's a token. Chips on a board, penny in a cup. You can use that for listener speaker, reader writers, or leader speaker's own listeners. Taking a task analysis and teaching it one step at a time, but from the end. So if you had their morning routine, maybe the last step is putting their dish in the sink before they get on the school bus. So you would help them through all the steps of their morning routine, except for that very last step. And once they do that 2 days in a row independently, now they are, let's say, what would be before that? They're turning off, the light in their room and making their bed and coming down the stairs, eating breakfast, and then putting their dish in the sink. And then the next day, they're, brushing their teeth independently, whatever. Like you work your way backwards. Vicarious reinforcement, we talked about that. And mastery rate criterion, that means meeting something to mastery before you move on to the next step. So mastery criterion, for learning some vocal directions. You'd want to see mastery of those vocal directions before you move on to new vocal directions. This is typically with discrete trial training. So if you're not using discrete trial training, you can implement mastery criterion, less formally, but basically you want to wait till they master something before you move on to the next step. Rate criterion is doing something to a predetermined amount of time. So you need to do your homework in half an hour or less if you want to watch TV tonight. And setting that timer and then, sticking to it. So pre-MAC principle. So if X, then Y. So this one's actually called Grandma's principle. If you eat your peas, you get to eat your ice cream. DRI, there's a lot of DR. It's DRI, DRH, a whole bunch of alphabet soup. DRI stands for differential reinforcement of incompatible behavior. For example, sitting in your chair is your target behavior for increase. Standing up out of your chair, that's your targeted behavior for decrease. Can't do both at the same time. So you want to reinforce the behavior that's incompatible with the behavior you want to decrease. For example, if you have a child who's, consistently biting their finger, you'd reinforce them obviously when they're not. You'd also want to set up more opportunities for that not to happen. So you'd work on, giving them, maybe they'd earn a lot of edibles while they're working with you, so that chewing the edible is not contingent with biting themselves. There's a lot, there'd be a whole behavior plan in place and things like that in that case. But increased opportunities to respond, we talked about already. So here's one more example. Overcorrection. Learner must repeatedly engage in a behavior as a penalty for admitting an aberrant behavior. Aberrant means bad. So you write on the desk. Now you got to clean all the desks in the whole classroom. Or if you spell a word wrong, you got to write it over and over and over again. And then on the left side here, I marked off which learners you'd use that with. And then, on your own time, before you fall asleep tonight, you come up with 3 more tactics that you would use and how you would use them. So these tactics, they're great, but, do you use them for performance, learning, or both? So what I did here is I highlighted, at least in my experience, and this is where me emailing it to you might be a little more useful, just so you could see the colors, but red is learning task, blue is performance, and then purple is both. Now, I'm not saying this is exclusively the way it is. It's just been in my experience. These are the tactics I've used for, so, that child who's hitting other kids, that would be a performance. Whereas, learning to write their name, that would be a learning task. So these different tactics that you would use it in these different areas here.
What is response?
We talked about this a little bit already, but when you're setting up rules, you want to keep them short and sweet. 3 rules max for our early learners, or up to 6 or 7 with kids with more advanced skills. You want to frame them positively. You want to talk about what we do, not what we don't do. We walk in the hallway. I said is greater or is better than. We don't run. We keep our hands to ourselves, not we don't hit. We use inside voices, not we don't scream. You want to use these to catch the kids being good. Don't let the kids' bad behavior be your antecedent to consequate them. You want to, as well, pay attention to the kids that are doing the right thing. So these statements here, so we don't scream inside, stop fidgeting in your chair, don't hit your brother. I want you guys to think in your head how you would fix those. Maybe, for example, we use inside voices, we sit nicely, things like that. Once you've come up with your rules for your learners, and different learners are going to have different rules. You might have 6 sets that you use. You want to catch them being good. You want to praise them for doing the right thing. I loved how you used walking feet. You did a good job finishing that puzzle. I can't believe you did it. You kept your hands to yourself. You don't want to say like great job, good, awesome. These things are awesome to say, and certainly I'm not saying don't say them, but I'm saying if every time they did emit a correct response, you're good job, good job, good job, it's going to get old. And they're also, sometimes they hear you praising them, but they're not sure what they're doing right, especially for someone who's not so aware of their own behavior in space. So for someone, for example, who is having a difficult time understanding personal space. So you have a 4-year-old that's tackling other kids and sitting on other kids' laps and, grabbing other kids' hair, and they're just not aware of their own personal space. If you say, because they're standing far from somebody, good job, they're not going to know what they're getting a good job for. But if you say, oh, that was, really nice how you, played with your friends, then they'll know, okay, I played with my friends, this far apart. So the more specific the praise, the better. So we're going to try some scenarios here. Questions before we do this part? Okay. So for example, we're going to kind of preface this with the rules are in place. You've delivered approvals for following the rules, and still some rules are broken. Here are some scenarios. What do you do? So let me explain what these 3 things are. Response block. Response block is when a bad behavior, an aberrant behavior is being emitted, you block it. So if you had a child that was going to bite their hand, or you had somebody who liked to hair pull, things like that, you block the behavior before it even happens. Overcorrection, that's when they have to, somebody stole a book, so they have to go and return the book to the person they stole it from and give them one of their books. Or, they dumped their milk on the floor and now they have to clean the whole floor. And stimulus prompt is when you set something up in the stimulus to make it a little bit easier for the learner. So we have Tommy. He's in the free play setting and he dumped a bin of toys. You ask him to stop and he looks right at you, grabs another bin and he dumps it out. What do you do? Overcorrection, good. Okay. Okay, Lily. Lily loves stickers. Oh, let me tell you what these things are first. So tolerance for reinforcement delay, that's where tokens come in. Tolerance for reinforcement delay means that the child is able to wait from in between emitting the behavior and access to the reinforcement. So they finally earn the iPad and the app they want to use is downloading and it says buffering and just the ability to sit and wait patiently as opposed to throwing a mega tantrum. Or if they ask for milk and you're having trouble opening it and they're able to sit and wait. Tokens we talked a lot about, and then peer modeling. So having a peer sit and model the correct behavior for them. So Lily loves stickers. She loves to collect stickers and put them in her sticker book. She also hits her brother when she's mad. You set up rules for her to follow. Sometimes she follows them, sometimes she doesn't. What else could you do for Lily? She loves to count her stickers. She loves to collect them. Tokens. Good. You probably could have her brother model nice hands too, but I was trying to go for tokens there. Rate criterion, that's when you do something to fluent rate within a set amount of time. PSI, that stands for personalized system of instruction. That is what like an online class would be PSI. It's taking a curriculum and there's really no face-to-face interaction. It's all reader-writer feedback. And then textual prompts. Textual prompts would be if you have a child, when you say, they can read, but when you say, how are you? They say back to you, how are you? And you say I'm fine, and they say I'm fine. So they're demonstrating some echolalic behavior. You might hold up a sign that says, I'm good. And you say, how are you? And you hold up the sign, and then they say, I'm good, because they're reading, not because, so your SD then would be the prompts, not your question, but you work on fading that out. But that's what a textual prompt is. It's a visual cue towards a target behavior. So Billy has mastered potty training. Great. We got him out of diapers. But when he goes to the toilet, he spends over 25 minutes in there using the bathroom, washing his hands, hanging out. He does so correctly, but it's impairing his ability to stick to his schedule. You're only at his house for 2 hours at a time. Goes to the bathroom twice. That's 50 minutes of your session. He's hanging out in the bathroom. What are you going to do? To rate, right. So you'll have him complete the task. Obviously, when he's on the toilet, you can't rush that. But maybe he's just hanging out playing in the sink with the bubbles, things like that. So you want to get him in and out of that bathroom. Great. So I think that's it. Here's my email. If anyone wants the e-copy of this, I'd be more than happy to email it to you. Or if you have questions or you need help finding articles about any of these tactics, please shoot me an email. Okay, thank you for coming, everyone.